San Juan Island, Pacific Northwest, 1859. There it is again, so proud and arrogant. "Get out of here, you damn pig!" you yell at the huge swine currently devouring your potatoes. It doesn't even look up as it continues to gorge. The defiance enrages you. Since coming west to pan for gold, your luck hasn't been the best. You didn't make your fortune or find any gold. All you have to your name is this ramshackle farm on a mostly deserted island in the back end of nowhere. Now even this is under threat from these ravenous pigs, hell spawn of the devil. You try to chase him off, but he easily dodges, and eventually you slip and fall into the mud. As you get up, spitting with rage, you hear hysterical laughter nearby. A Hudson Bay Company herder has been watching your antics and is laughing his head off. Something snaps in your head. No longer will these pigs terrorize your farm. Racing into your shack, you emerge with your rifle. The pig still pays no attention as it gobbles down your potatoes. Smiling, you raise your rifle and fire. The pig falls to the ground and doesn't move. Finally, revenge for all the vegetables you have lost to this menace. You are triumphant. Little do you know that by killing that pig, you will almost start a war between Britain and America. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. After covering some particularly heavy topics, this episode will be something of a palate cleanser as we cover the Pig War of 1859. A long-time dispute over a remote connection of islands between Britain, Canada and the United States threatens to turn into a war after the assassination of a helpless pig. Join me for a tale of grumpy farmers, pompous officials, generals looking to start a war to become president, and probably the funniest war in history. For most of the 19th century, Britain and America did not have the close special relationship that we know of today. Both nations carried deep wounds from the American Revolution, which were only scratched raw with the War of 1812. While peace treaties reduced the chance of another clash, there were several minor conflicts between the US and British North America throughout the 1830s. While the political and military leaders in Washington and London did not want a war might still find them. The US had grown steadily in power, population and size from those original 13 colonies clinging to the edge of a vast continent. America now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, creating one of the largest nations on Earth. But with this expansion came problems along its northern border with the British Empire. Most of these had been resolved peacefully, though not without a few war scares. The Pacific Northwest area, also known as the Oregon Territory to the US and Columbia to the British, was still up for grabs. Of course, the native Indians living there would have said it belonged to them, but Britain and America were not interested in their views. Both nations wanted this territory for different reasons. The Hudson Bay Company, one of the mega-corporations that really built the British Empire, and also the oldest company in North America, controlled most of Canada at this time. It was primarily interested in the Oregon Territory for the furs it could buy from the native Indians. It even discouraged settlers, as it was thought they would interfere with the fur trade. Ironically, the Hudson Bay Company has recently gone bankrupt this year, now a retailer rather than the North American version of the East India Company. How the mighty have fallen. The Americans, on the other hand, were desperate for a Pacific port so it could engage in the lucrative China trade. This really meant selling the Chinese opium so they could buy tea and porcelain in return. Remember, at this time, Mexico still controlled California, so Oregon Territory was America's only hope for such a port. Unlike the Brits, they wanted their settlers to pour in and start farming the land. As several thousand Americans filtered into the Oregon Territory by the early 1840s, a clash seemed imminent. President James Polk was elected in 1844 in a narrow election, mainly thanks to his pledge to annex California and Oregon. He had even used the nifty slogan, 54-40 or fight, as the whole of Oregon extended north to 54 degrees, 40 minutes north latitude. This meant America should annex the whole area or go to war with Britain. War seemed a real possibility, but Britain got lucky. Polk was a Southern slave owner. Indeed, his hobby while president was to buy and sell slaves from the White House. While he certainly played hardball with the British and threatened war, his preferred target was conquering Mexican territory and expanding Southern slavery. He was willing to do a deal, and the border was fixed at the 49th parallel. The American half would become the states of Oregon and Washington. The rest would make up the Canadian province of British Columbia. There was just one small issue that hadn't been resolved: the fate of the San Juan Islands. The Treaty of Oregon said the line of boundary between the territories of the United States and those of Her Britannic Majesty shall be continued westward along the said 49th parallel of north latitude to the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver's Island, and thence southerly through the middle of the said channel and of Fuca's Strait to the Pacific Ocean. This seems pretty straightforward, but there are two passages through the San Juan Islands, and the treaty didn't specify where the divide should lie. To add to the confusion, the maps available of the region weren't really up to scratch, and both nations left the negotiations with very different ideas of where exactly this boundary lay. Both the US and Britain believed they owned these islands, and the scene was set for yet more drama about the US-Canadian border. To strengthen the British claim, the Hudson Bay Company set up a sheep farm on the main San Juan Island, run by an Irishman called Charles John Griffin. It was he who imported the soon-to-be infamous Berkshire boars, allowing them to run wild on the island. Griffin would not be allowed to farm in peace if the United States had anything to do with it. The local sheriff of the county neighbouring the islands demanded that Griffin pay him taxes, as it was American territory. When he refused, Sheriff Barnes decided to auction off the sheep to pay the tax bill. Landing in the dead of night with a party of prospective bidders, they managed to round up 50 rams and had a midnight auction on the beach. There was a problem, however. The boats they had used to get there were far too small to hold their new sheep. After an almighty uproar and multiple injuries to the buyers, they escaped with less than half of their new property. Once Washington, D.C. found out about the midnight sheep rustling, the sheriff was ordered to give them back and stop provoking the British. That must have been one upset sheriff. The first round had gone to Britain, but after a brief gold rush in British Columbia, about 20 former American miners settled on San Juan Island and began to farm. One of these was the man we met in the opening dramatization, Lyman Cutler. He wasn't the luckiest of men. After trying to make his fortune in various gold rushes, he had little to show for it. His ramshackle farm on the island was his latest get-rich-quick scheme. There was just one fly in the ointment: the roaming pigs that kept eating his vegetables. Like most disputes between neighbours that start off about something small, the swine problem seems to have grown out of all proportion between Griffin and Cutler. The two confirmed bachelors stuck on this remote island quickly began to hate the sight of each other. After repeated complaints about the pigs, Cutler later claimed that they had, quote, been at several times a great annoyance, end quote. He finally snapped, and in a fit of rage, he gunned down an unarmed, helpless pig. Despite his later bravado, Cutler at first realized he may have gone too far and went to Griffin to confess his crime. He didn't take it well. Griffin was already fed up of being practically marooned on the island. Added to this, he was angry at the American farmers, who he regarded as squatters, particularly Cutler, who had been complaining about his prize pigs. When the American offered $10 compensation, Griffin threw a fit. The pig was a prize breeding boar and was worth at least $100, he screamed. Cutler now got angry, refusing to pay such a huge amount. Quote, "It was eating my potatoes," end quote, he yelled. Griffin replied, quote, "It is up to you to keep your potatoes out of my pig," end quote. That line really reminds me of arguments I've had with my little daughter. The meeting descended into a screaming match, ending with Cutler allegedly retorting he would, quote, "as soon as shoot Griffin as he would a hog if Griffin trespassed on his land," end quote. Quite by chance, a Hudson's Bay Company vessel carrying Alexander Dallas, governor of Hudson Bay Company's operations west of the Rockies, arrived at the island that afternoon. It was one of those coincidences that kept on happening in the early stages of this war, fueling the fires of escalation. Griffin was all too eager to let him know all about the incident with the pig. Dallas probably should have written this off as a personal grievance and let the matter drop, but for a mixture of stubbornness and probably anti-American sentiment, he did the opposite. Immediately, he rode with 3 companions to Cutler's house and confronted him 4-on-1. As you arrive at the farm, really more of a shack with some poorly maintained fields, the American comes out looking warily at the 4 of you. The governor speaks first. "Are you Cutler?" "Who wants to know?" The American shouts back. "You have shot a pig belonging to the Hudson Bay Company and refused recompense. How could you do such a thing?" continues the governor. Cutler spits out, "That pig was worthless, and you know it. I ain't paying any limey for a worthless potato. Stealing pig." The governor is getting angry now. "This island is a possession of Her Majesty. If you do not pay for the pig, you could be arrested and deported from this island." You wonder if this was a wise remark. Cutler goes red in the face and races back into his shack, emerging with a gun. This is American soil, not English. As he rants and waves his rifle around, you tell the governor that this is not safe and that you should retreat. Before riding off, the governor turns around and yells, "You will have to answer for this hereafter." As the party rides off, you say to the governor, "Tempers are obviously running high. If we let both gentlemen have some time to cool off, I'm sure we can resolve this situation." The governor glares at you and roars, "That, sir, is no gentleman. That is an American." Though no attempt was actually made to arrest Cutler, his fellow settlers reacted defiantly. The 4th of July, American Independence Day, provided an ideal occasion for them to assert American sovereignty. 14 men, almost the entire American population of the island, gathered together for a raucous flag-raising ceremony. After a speech by each of the 14 men, and no doubt at least that many patriotic toasts, the stars and stripes were raised on a newly erected 55-foot flagpole. This farcical situation could still have been contained, if not for another coincidence. One of the settlers, Paul K. Hubbs Jr., a deputy customs collector, was friends with a U.S. Army officer called Captain George E. Pickett. Pickett was a hero of the Mexican-American War and would later lead the infamous Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg during the American Civil War. He just so happened to be stationed at the nearby Fort Bellingham on the mainland, and his good friend Hubbs raced over to let him know of this latest affront to American dignity. In turn, Pickett told his commander, Brigadier General William S. Harney, who came to investigate. Involving Harney in any situation was like pouring gasoline on a fire and then throwing on some TNT for good measure. Harney is a strong contender for being the worst officer the U.S. Army has ever known. I'm going to do a deep dive into his background, as he is just so awful. He was an angry, cruel, racist hothead who even shocked people at the time with his conduct. While serving at Fort Winnebago, perhaps foreshadowing the events at San Juan Island, he saw a fellow soldier's dog uprooting the fort's vegetable patch and brutally beat it to death. Not content with animal cruelty, his next victim would be a young slave girl while he was stationed in St. Louis. Unable to find the keys to his in-laws' home, Harney blamed their house slave Hannah and beat her with a rawhide strap repeatedly over 3 days. The torture only ended when she died of her wounds. Even in slaveholding St. Louis, Harney's actions were considered shocking, and he was forced to flee to the East Coast to avoid vigilante justice. A mob tried to pull down his house, and a local paper denounced him as a monster. When a slaveholding society is telling you that you've gone too far in your treatment of black people, that's really saying something. Facing an indictment in St. Louis for murder, Harney secured a change of venue so it could be heard before a pro-slavery judge called Judge Lawless. Not the best name for a judge. Unsurprisingly, he was acquitted of all charges. He learnt nothing from this episode, and his career continued to be marred by cruelty and violence. Serving at a base in Oklahoma, he beat a soldier almost to death for refusing to dig a latrine and had to be pulled off by his fellow officers. He also owned a group of muscular male slaves at this time who he enjoyed provoking into fistfights with soldiers known for brawling. His fellow officers hated him and complained that Harney's, quote, arbitrary and unmilitary conduct was not in keeping with good order and military discipline, end quote. he was court-martialed, defending himself as being merely, quote, naturally boisterous, while serving my country to the best of my abilities. End quote. He was convicted, but only sentenced to a 4-month suspension. Even this punishment was eventually squashed. He is a truly despicable human being, and we are not even at the worst part yet. During the First Sioux War, he was acclaimed as a hero after winning the Battle of Ash Hollow. However, this soon changed as news leaked out that this was no battle. An Indian village filled with women, children, and the elderly had tried to surrender under a white flag, but Harney refused to accept it. Instead, his men brutally slaughtered the unarmed villagers, even repeatedly firing a cannon into a cave where women and children are hidden. Harney was proud of his actions, boasting that, quote, I have come to kill Indians, and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little, knits make lasts. End quote. The newspapers renamed it the Harney Massacre, and the Sioux gave him the charming nicknames of Woman Killer, the Butcher, and the Big Chief Who Swears. Rather than burying the victims of the massacre, he deliberately left their bodies for the wolves to eat, to show his contempt for the Native Americans. He was equally cruel to his own men on this expedition as well. Upon being informed that his intended winter quarters at Fort Pierre didn't have enough food or supplies for his army, he decided to still make the 2,000-mile march there, as otherwise he would, quote, lose much of my prestige. The results would more compensate for any loss of animals or men. End quote. Needless to say, his army suffered multiple deaths from malnutrition-related illnesses and frostbite amputations. His soldiers bitterly sang that, we will never forgive old Harney for bringing us to Fort Pierre. At a meeting with the leaders of the Sioux at the fort, he then managed to kill another dog. Harney wanted to theatrically display the, quote, great power of the white man, end quote, to impress the Native Americans. This included the ability to apparently, quote, kill and bring life again, end quote. Harney had his surgeon put a dog into anesthesia with chloroform and demonstrated the dog's apparent death to the attendees. When the surgeon failed to revive the dog, Harney's hubris was met with derisive laughter by the assembled Native American leaders. That's General Harney, everyone. Truly an absolutely awful man. As the settlers complained to him about the pig shooting, Harney asked them to send a written petition asking for military protection from the, quote, oppressive interference of the authorities of the Hudson Bay Company at Victoria, end quote. There is a conspiracy theory that Harney wanted to start a war with Britain to stop the upcoming American Civil War. So far, all of this is happening in 1859. In 1860, the southern states were going to start succeeding, and then the first shots were fired in 1861. I think this gives too much credit to Harney. While I do think he wanted to provoke a war, or at least a major confrontation, it was more for his own personal ambitions. He may have been an aggressive, racist, murdering bully, but he still thought he would make a great president. If he became a war hero who tweaked the lion's tail, who knew what could happen? It also helped that he was very anti-British. Upon receiving the petition he had recommended in the first place, Harney immediately sent 66 soldiers under the command of Pickett to occupy the island of San Juan. Even more provocatively, Pickett then posted a proclamation that, this being the United States territory, no laws other than those of the United States, nor courts except such as are held by virtue of said laws, will be recognized or allowed on this island. This was a goad to the British Lion, and it worked. Governor James Douglas of Vancouver Island was furious and immediately ordered 3 Royal Navy ships under the command of Captain Geoffrey Hornby, with orders to stop any more American troops being landed or fortifications built. Unlike Douglas, the Royal Navy had little desire for a confrontation. Indeed, at that period, official British naval policy was one of restraint and minimum intervention. The Navy captains of Victoria were well aware that their commander, Admiral Baines, was a firm believer in this policy, and they were reluctant to follow orders from Douglas that risked violating it. Under pressure from the officers, Douglas revised his orders. He commanded Hornby to land a contingent of Royal Marines to balance the American forces. In the end, Hornby wouldn't even do this. He had met with Pickett, who blustered that he would attack any attempt at landing, and that, quote, "we'll make a Bunker Hill of it," end quote, referring to the famous British defeat in the American Revolution. Both sides were lucky that in Hornby they had someone who was finally willing to make a decision to de-escalate the crisis caused by the Pickettside. Rear Admiral Lambert Baines backed up Hornby's decision when he returned to Victoria on August 5th, 1859, famously saying that, quote, "2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig would be foolish," end quote. Quite so, Admiral, quite so. Both sides continued to reinforce, however, the danger wasn't over yet. Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey arrived with more American soldiers and took over command from Pickett. His first action was to move the American camp, as it was currently so exposed it could easily be destroyed by the British fleet. This became the American camp, home of American troops on the island for the next 15 years. Both sides continued to reinforce until by early August 1859, 461 Americans with 14 cannons faced a now increased British fleet of 5 warships with at least 70 guns and 2,140 men. The British could clearly take the island if they wanted to, but they, like their American counterparts, had received strict instructions. Stay on the defensive. Make your presence felt, but whatever you do, don't shoot first. All these men, guns and ships on a tiny island, all over a dead swine. As the standoff continued, tourists began to arrive to observe the action. Lyman Cutler even began to complain about his farm being trampled by tourists, wanting to catch a glimpse of the man who shot the pig. Many chose to stay, so a whole new settlement, known as San Juan Town, sprang up on the shore of the bay, where makeshift liquor establishments and brothels were soon attracting soldiers and civilians alike. It helped that as both sides refused to recognize each other's laws, San Juan was now basically lawless and became the roughest town on the Pacific coast. Because of the distance involved, it was not until September that the American and British governments learned they had almost gone to war on San Juan Island. The telegraph was in use locally on the East Coast and in England, but wires were not yet strung across the continent, much less the ocean. The British authorities privately approved of Admiral Baines' restraint and demanded an explanation from the Americans for landing troops on the island before the boundary dispute was resolved. President James Buchanan and Secretary of State Lewis Cass were in the awkward position of trying to explain Harley's actions that they had neither known of nor approved. Buchanan sent Lieutenant General Winfield Scott to resolve the crisis. A hero of the Mexican-American War, He had also successfully mediated disputes over the US-Canadian border in the 1830s. 73 years old, obese, suffering from gout, and nearly immobile due to a recent riding accident, he would never actually go ashore during his time in the Pacific Northwest. All negotiations were by aids and letters. You can argue this further helped cool things down by slowing down the whole process. The conclusion of these negotiations were about as far from a resolution as they could get. Both nations agreed to scale down their forces to no more than 100 men and jointly occupy the island, with both flags flying proudly in their respective camps. So basically, neither agreed to cede the island to the other, which is pretty much where the whole mess began, before a harmless pig was brutally murdered. Pickett was ordered to leave the island, and Scott heavily hinted to Harney that he should resign for his conduct. Of course, he refused to do this. Instead, he determined he was going to rile things up again, so he ordered poor Pickett back to the island as soon as Scott went home. This time, though, he had gone too far. He was now removed from his post, and Pickett left the island for the last time. The British built a camp on the island's north end. The Americans kept their camp on the south end. Relations now became pretty cordial. The Americans invited the British to celebrate the 4th of July with them, while the Yanks would visit the British for Victoria's birthday celebrations. They even attended joint church services and had regular social events and athletics contests. The main issues on the island were not Anglo-American rivalry, but rampant crime and complaints from the American settlers. San Juan town kept its reputation for rowdiness and remained a hive of scum and villainy. Neither taxes nor import duties were collected, and smugglers seeking to evade duties on products such as wool made use of the island. Historian Edmund Meany noted that San Juan sheep soon became notorious for producing as much as 150 pounds of wool each per season. Despite having asked for the soldiers to be sent to the island in the first place, the US settlers quickly tired of military rule. Their grumbling and complaints soon made the American officers' lives hell. One officer is even alleged to have said, quote, "Can't we just give these ungrateful men and these damned islands to the British?" End quote. "Things are relatively quiet here now," says your new commanding officer as he takes you on a tour of San Juan Island. "Just remember, take a firm line with the enemy." As a proud young US lieutenant, you straighten your shoulders and say smartly, "Don't you worry, Colonel. I will stand up to the British." "Oh, I didn't mean the Limeys. Our relations are good with them. I meant the local American farmers. The rudest bunch of men I've ever met. The rest of the locals are thieves, drunks, and criminals, usually all three together." Surprised, you can't but agree that San Juan town is a dive. A drunk old man is thrown out of a makeshift cabin into the mud in front of you. A toothless crone yells, "And stay out!" As he staggers to his feet, he sees your uniforms and slurs, "I only wanted one more drink. Won't you defend an American's rights?" The crone yells back, "This is British territory, Yank." A small crowd has formed, including a British officer. He merely smiles and nods cheerfully at your commanding officer. "Let's stay out of this one, old chap." "I agree. This is clearly a personal matter. See you at church tomorrow," he replies. An angry man races up to you. "What's the point of you being here and taxing us poor farmers if you won't defend Americans? You should go back to the mainland. You're not wanted here. As he storms off, your officer sighs and says, "That was Lyman Cutler." "The man who shot the pig?" you say, surprised. "Yes, the more time I spend with him, the more I sympathize with the pig." San Juan isn't exactly what you thought it would be. The joint occupation wasn't meant to last long, but with the advent of the American Civil War, the whole dispute was pushed to the very bottom of Abraham Lincoln's to-do list. Finally, in 1872, Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany became a neutral arbiter of the dispute. It's hard to remember that up until 1890, there wasn't this great fear of Germany, so there she could be a neutral arbiter. He appointed a three-man commission to consider the claims. It met for more than a year. On October the 21st, 1872, the commission decided that everything east of the Harrow Strait belonged to the United States, and the islands to the west belonged to the newly formed Dominion of Canada. The last great territorial dispute between Britain and America was over. What happened to the man who shot the pig? Lyman Cutler at first gained prestige from the episode. He was elected constable by the Americans on the island, and later served as a deputy sheriff, a post he held until May 1864. Then apparently he became fed up with being known as the pig murderer and left for the mainland. He would die before the islands would become American territory. There is much that is comic about this war. The pig jokes write themselves, and its conclusion is actually pretty heartwarming. However, it must be remembered that if not for a Hornby or a Scott, the swine shooting of 1859 could easily have led to a third Anglo-American war. Today, both the British and American camps can still be visited in San Juan Island, National Historical Park. Interestingly, this is the only place in a US national park where a foreign flag is regularly hoisted over US soil, and both the flag and the flagpole were provided by the British government as a sign of friendship. I have certainly added it to my bucket list, much to the horror of my family, I'm sure. As for General Harney, I have to admit, before I researched it, I was sure he must have sided with the Confederacy as a slave owner. But no, he stayed loyal to the Union. Though, when the succession crisis occurred, he was in Missouri, and was quickly replaced after he was accused of favouring the Confederates in that state. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, subscribe, leave a review, or tell a friend. Next week I'm going to be away, so our next episode is coming out on Monday the 1st of September. I have a really exciting autumn season for you. We have episodes on just how crazy the Canadians were in World War I. We'll join the British as they battle the Italians in the North African desert, before they launch probably the worst commando raid in all of World War II. We uncover the greatest traitor in all of American history, and we'll be heading to the Korean War. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.